So is pride a big deal? Does it really matter if we act in pride or arrogance? Isn't pride a social norm after all? It's not like lying or cheating or sexual promiscuity or violence. The Bible speaks against all these things, but is pride really in that same category as these other sins? God is a God of great grace. His grace far exceeds what we can imagine. It will reach for a person that is strayed far from him. James 4:8 reads, "Come near to God and he will draw near to you." We see an example of how that looks in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. The prodigal had left his father's house with the intention of experiencing the pleasures of life without any restraints or limitations, in full abandonment and in direct violation of his purpose and the will of his father. But when he realized the bitter void of it all, he decided to go back and return to his father's house. And we read in Luke 15:20, when he's on his way back to his father's house, we read, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and he kissed him." When someone turns to God, whether they are the worst of human sinners, God is ready to reach for them, except when they are full of pride. The Bible says in James chapter 4 and verse 6, God opposes the proud, but he shows favor to the humble. Psalms 138 and verse 6 says, he looks kindly at the lowly, though lofty, or the proud, he sees them from afar off. There are other scriptures like this that let us know how God feels about pride. What murder or sexual immorality will not do, pride will do. When you say the scriptures, you will see that each one of us has a purpose. You and I were created on purpose for a purpose. You may have a different talents, callings, unique purposes that separates you from everyone else. Here's what each one of us has to realize. While we may have secondary purposes, one of our primary purposes is to be a worshiper of God. Deuteronomy 6 verse 1 says, "These are the commands, decrees, the laws of the Lord your God directed me to teach you." This is Moses speaking. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. It's a picture of a worshiper. It's an Old Testament text, but Jesus quoted it numerous times in the New Testament. It's quoted in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 37, in Mark 12 and verse 30, and Luke 10 and verse 37. Jesus also said in John 4:23, "But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth." And then it says this, "For the Father," or God, "seeketh such to worship him." God is looking for worshipers. The reason why pride is so bad, we read about in Psalms 10 and verse 4, "In his pride the wicked man does not seek him," doesn't seek God. "In all his thoughts there is no room for God." You and I are closest to our created purpose when we are worshiping God. Now, what is worship? When we think about worship, we're thinking about a worship service, a worship song, what a worship leader does. Worship is not an act that you do or a transition from praise in a service. Worship is not a function to perform at a given time. True worship is not a feeling. True worship is a result of an awareness of the greatness of God. It's a revelation of his majesty. Worship doesn't need a song. It only needs an opportunity. Service to God is worship. You serve him for the mere reason that he is great, that he is deserving. It's an awareness. It's a revelation. That is why when you're raising your kids, it can become worship. When you're cleaning your house, it can be worship. When you do it with an awareness of him, that it is he who gives it. It is he who entrusted you with it. It is he who made you a steward. Because worship is an awareness of his awesomeness. But the proud do not serve God, do not worship him, do not acknowledge him. A non-worshiper is not the opposite of a worshiper. If worship is our created purpose and awareness of his greatness, but the proud is caught up in awareness of himself, caught up with a self-sufficiency, then pride is to exist in direct contradiction to our created purpose. The opposite of a worshiper is a proud person. The devil may have been the music leader in heaven, but he was not the worship leader, because you cannot be a worshiper and be full of pride at the same time. They cannot exist simultaneous. You might be able to sing and be full of pride, and you might be able to lift up your hands and look the part of a worshiper, but you will not be a worshiper because it cannot exist with pride. You can even call it worship. You call it what you want, but pride and worship cannot coexist. In some Christian circles, pride can be overlooked. It will be overlooked because the talent someone might have. It will be overlooked because of the financial support someone might give to the church. But God rejects the proud. How should we feel about it? Humility can make all the difference, and awareness that we are nothing in comparison to his greatness, and it will save us and it will help us. Psalms 51, written by David after he has sinned with Bathsheba, after he had committed adultery. And he was aware that in Levitical law there was not any sacrifice that he could offer. There was nothing in the Levitical law that would give place for him to be put in right standing with God. It says in Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 2, it says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if a soul shall sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning things which ought not to be done, and shall do against any of them." How does it? Through ignorance. Okay. Then it goes on to say, "Then let him bring for his sin, which he has sinned, a young bullock without blemish unto the Lord for a sin offering." When David committed adultery with Bathsheba, he did not do it through ignorance. It was not by mistake. It was it wasn't something that he did by accident, but it was intentional. When he sent notice to Joab to put Uriah at the front line so that he could be killed in battle, it was intentional. It was not through ignorance. And he understood that there was nothing, there was not a sacrifice that he could offer. We read in Psalms 51 and verse 16, David writes, "For thou desireth not sacrifice, else I would give it, and thou delightest not in burnt offering." David was aware of his situation. But then it goes on to say in verse 17, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise." In other words, he understood with a humbleness, with a humbleness, a brokenness before God, that would allow him. That was his best chance. You see Saul, and when you consider the sins of Saul in comparison with the sins of David, they seem, the consequence seems disproportionate. But what kept Saul away from God was his condition of pride. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 17 says, "When you were little in your own eyes, were you not head of the tribes of Israel? And did not the Lord anoint you king over Israel?" That's how the Lord had chosen him, had found him. But we read in 1 Samuel 15 and verse 30, after he had disobeyed the commands of God and after he had rebelled against his instructions, Saul says, "I have sinned." And while that is a great acknowledgement, he doesn't stop there. He says, "I have sinned, yet honor me now." He's talking to Samuel. "Yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people, before Israel, and return with me." Saul was more concerned with how people perceived him than how God perceived him. There are consequences of sin, and the Bible teaches us that the consequences of pride is that it keeps God from us. Many people run from pride, and I have learned that pride will chase after you at a faster speed than you can go. The answer is not to run from pride and fear, but to run towards humility with desire. The solution is not to fear pride, but to desire humility so as to make pride lose its luster and attraction. Because God resists the proud.